morning. My name is George Ramsbottom. We're here on our Let's Talk Dairy webinar for our podcast for today. You're all very welcome. Today I'm joined by two people, not one. One wasn't enough for me today. I had to get two involved. So I'm joined by John Maher from the Grass10 team based in Moore Park, and by Mike Dineen, who's our nutritionist researcher based in Moore Park as well. Now we're going to split this slightly. We're going to talk to John first for a very brief update on where the grass situation is at the moment, and then we'll move on and talk to Mike about nutritional guidelines and our thinking there for early spring calf cows. So we're going to start here now first with John. And John, you're going to give us a kind of a brief update on where the whole grass supply is at the moment on farms.
Yeah, well, I suppose to start with, George, look, the weather the last week of January has been very, very good. We're well below average rainfall. The first week of February is projected to be well below average rainfall from most of the country, with the exception of the northwest. So, from a grass perspective, it's an ideal opportunity to get slurry out, get fertilizer out to boost grass supply, and to get cows out to start grazing. From a grass supply situation, the pasture-based figures tell us that we're a little below where we'd like to be. The regrowth rates over the winter have been, below average, 3 or 4 kilos. So we're starting the spring a little bit below where we normally would be. We're about 100 kilos per hectare back on last year. The average figures from pasture base for the last 2 weeks have been about 800 kilos. So that, people like me would prefer 900 kilos a thousand to opening cover on the 1st of February. So you have a great chance now. Soil temperatures have gone well over 6 in the last few days, and are well over 7 for the last 2 or 3 days. So on dry land, so it's a great opportunity to get slurry out. We can't put slurry everywhere, but we can then also capitalize on boosting grass supply by getting fertilizer and nitrogen out. Our target would be 23 units per acre, 25 kilos per hectare, half bag of urea thereabouts per acre. And I think they're the tasks for this week. So you have a great chance to get cows out, slurry out, fertilizer out.
Okay, that's nice and crisp, John. I think there's enough in that for our group here today, for our audience here today. Look at John, this is a little snip that you're going to give us each week yourself, or some of the Grass10 team will, in the coming weeks. So we look forward to your contribution from next week on again. Thanks very much, John.
All right, thank you, George.
Now what we're going to do is we're going to break now and move into talk to Mike Dineen. And Mike, you're going to tell us a little bit about where we're fixed in terms of our guidance for nutrition of the early, or supplementation of the freshly calved cow in early spring. So maybe we take it on from the scenario, Mike, where we might be a little bit tight on grass, but cows still need to be fed. So what's our thinking at the moment when it comes to that sort of situation?
Yeah, so thanks for having me on, George. I suppose there's two main things we need to kind of consider. The first one is our average farm cover, like John was referring to, and our grazing targets, trying to achieve those to set up the farm for the year and the grazing season ahead. And then the other thing to be mindful of, I suppose, is the pure nutrition of the cow, kind of response to supplementation, economics brought, so the wider picture of environmental. So I suppose in a scenario where we can get lots of grass into the cow, like the weather is currently providing, this early stage cow, probably 4 to 5 kilos would be plenty for her. Mike Egan has very good data there recently on dry matter intake in the first few weeks of lactation. He'll be talking about it next week or the week after. But around 4 to 5 kilos would be over 25% of her diet, and that seems to be plenty early on lactation, and even opportunity to drop that if again you can access lots of grass. So if the fortunate scenario there of plenty of grass, I'd be aiming for that. Ideally, keep it around 3 to 4 if possible, and that should be plenty to keep the cow in a good trajectory to hit her peak.
And along with good quality silage or plenty of grass, what kind of milk yield will that support in early lactation, Mike?
Yeah, so that level of supplementation, 3 to 4 kilos, should be setting her up to be heading for the 2 and heading towards the 2.2, 2.3 kilos of milk solids. We've lots of data over the years here in Moore Park and across in Kilworth, and that 3 to 4 kilos should give you a nice economic response there early on. If we go past that, if we head up for 5, 6, 7, we're starting to get that diminishing response. So while we'll make more milk, it won't return back to us in terms of profitability. And the other big thing we'll start to do is we'll start to substitute that high quality pasture. So instead of making a nice margin on that inexpensive high quality feed of pasture, we'll be bringing in more expensive supplement and not getting as much of a response back from it, and ultimately harming our overall performance. So just to be mindful of that too, I suppose.
And Mike, no issue in terms of stepping them up to 3 to 4 kilos with acidosis or anything like that, is there? You wouldn't be worried about that at that level?
Yeah, so I suppose in experiment scenarios here, we like to gradually increase them, right? 3 to 4, again, as I mentioned, it's about 25% of the diet. So it's not a huge a lump of concentrate going in. It'll be split morning and evening. So maybe gradually that fresh cow getting her 2 to 3 to 4 over 2 or 3 days even is just nice. It helps her kind of adapt to it. And similarly, coming off the other side, when grass is really plentiful, we're heading into April and May, step them down off it as well over a couple of days if possible. So you're taking out a very concentrated kilo of dry matter and getting the cow to replace it with a larger volume of fresh material. So just to be mindful again to work them off it, but not to be nervous of working them off it when there's the high quality pasture there available.
Okay. Mike, what about getting them on a bit of meal before they calve? Is there any advantage in doing that?
So that's an interesting one, all right. I suppose there's the main aspect I'd see, or kind of objective I'd see for putting meal early on before lactation, say 21 days, 3 weeks before, it seems to be around more of a colostrum concern, or getting the cow to produce nice volumes of colostrum. In the US, I've done a PhD over there, they'd be talking about steam up diets and this aspect, but in our scenario, there's been work done in Moore Park, and there wasn't any major additional benefit to be achieved compared to good quality grass silage. Okay. So the thought process, I suppose, is that the cow needs a certain amount of metabolizable protein. She's that fetus is growing fast. She's getting her mammary gland set up. She's about to start producing high volumes of colostrum and milk. So she's a higher demand for metabolizable protein. So the thought process would be to give her something like oats or soya to get that MP supply going. But when you compare it to good quality grass silage that can be fermented in the cow's rumen and grow microbial protein, there's not a massive benefit to be achieved there. So maybe if struggling with colostrum quality, it might be worth a shot. But as a general, I'd say if you can keep good quality silage to those cows 3 weeks out from calving, you should be in good shape.
Okay. So what about the composition then of the diet, of the concentrated feed that you're talking about then, Mike? Does it have to be high protein, high energy, or what do you put into it?
Yeah, so the protein one is very interesting. I suppose that's another thing to be mindful of when we're feeding supplement. You know, we're talking about reducing chemical nitrogen and reducing nitrogen imports. We need to be mindful too of purchase feed. There's nitrogen in that as well. So there's lots of studies at the moment where they've looked at protein level in the ration at a grass-based diet, and it seems we can go quite low. We can go down to 10 to 12% when grass is the main component of the diet. Yep. We're going to do some more work on that in Kilworth this year. But then in this period of time, I suppose there's grass silage in the diet. And then that grass silage can be variable. On average, it's around 13 to 14% protein. Good quality silage could be up 15 to 16. So just, I suppose, in the month of February, I like to keep a 16% protein ration to the cows. Just it gives you that bit of a safety factor if they're not out at grass full time and they're back in on silage. We're not shorting the rumen on protein or nitrogen. I wouldn't be going for an 18 or a 20. I don't think it's needed. Our spring grass is high in protein as well. Unless you're on a full silage diet, then you might be heading up the protein percent. But I'd be happy to keep it around 16. And then in terms of composition, Joe Patton has great work done on that, and he'd typically advise a third of like a starch source, maybe a maize or a cereal, a third of digestible fiber, so soya hulls or beet pulps, and then a third of a protein source, kind of mixed between distillers and soya to get your protein inclusion level. So yeah, in terms of that, since we'd have had done some work lately on concentrate composition, and we hope to do more on it to see how much of an effect does it have on performance.
Okay. Now, what about the scenario there, Mike, where we have very high yielding cows? We're ramping up for 40, 45 kilos. Say within a herd that's going to average about 30. Should they be treated separately? Should they get the extra bit of ration, or what's the story there?
So yeah, quite a complex one, I suppose. So if averaging 30 and we're thinking about the 40, 45, 50 litre cows, I suppose the first thing is to step back and see how many of them are actually in the herd. When you look at the profile of yields in the herd, for roughly a herd averaging 30, maybe 5 or 10% of the cows will be up there in that very high milk yield places. Actually, over in the Kilworth farm, we'd have a few of those as well. And what we find is when you look at their dry matter intake, their pasture dry matter intake, they have the capacity to eat huge volumes of pasture. So they're hitting intakes of 24, 25 kilos of dry matter intake. So those type of cows that can really hit the volume can also look after themselves once we give them high quality pasture is the thing. We can't be giving them STEMI and digestible material. It'll fill up their rumen. They won't be able to utilize it. So we need to keep high quality grass to them. So I'd be advising working really hard on your pasture management, hitting your optimal covers, allowing enough grass, not over allowing that you're pushing up your post-grazing height, but making sure you're not holding back the cows either by pushing them too low into a very low residual. And then in terms of the feed to yield, Joe and Aidan Lawless would have done work down in Johnstown looking at that question, feed to yield versus a blanket. And while there is some advantage to be gained there, especially around peak, it doesn't really persist out into lactation. And again, there's not a huge margin to be gained there, especially when you factor in the hardware and the software to achieve feed to yield. So I suppose in my mind, I'd keep it simple, and I'd be relatively simple, and I'd be focusing on really, really good grassland management, setting up that basal diet, and then taking care of her with the 3 or 4 kilos of ration when grass is plentiful.
Okay, so it sounds like we're not going mad on ration. We're not going wild on protein content unless they're indoors full time. And now we're not really focusing on feed to yield as much at all. As you reckon the cows can compensate if they're high yielding, which is very interesting.
I think they can take care of themselves. Right, that's a fair point, George.
Last thing I have for you, Mike, and if any of our attendees want to ask a Q&A now is the time. But the last question I have for you, Mike, is what are your thoughts around turnout? Is it immediately after calving, or there's kind of a school of thought now about maybe holding them in for 3 or 4 days after they've calved, let them settle down, fill the room, and all the rest of it? What are your thoughts there?
So I suppose it's a difficult one. Again, I suppose there isn't a huge amount of data strictly comparing it in a controlled manner, but the approach we like to use in Kilworth, we typically try to get the cow to grass by day as soon as possible. So get her out for those couple hours, get some fresh grass into her, maybe stretch the legs a bit. And then we like to hold her back at night on the grass silage for the first 4 to 5 days. So we'd essentially have a colostrum group that go out by day and stay in by night. And that bit of grass silage, maybe slightly higher dry matter content, they might be able to fill themselves that bit better while they're a relatively fresh cow just after going through calving. So that's the approach we like to take with them. Out by day, get them grazing, help hit our targets, and then keep them in by night. And then important to say, if there's any health concern, if she's a likely case for milk fever or anything like that, of course you'll be holding her in and keeping a closer eye on her.
Okay, perfect. Guys and ladies, if you have any questions, now is your time to ask them. I'm running out of questions here from Mike myself, so this is your opportunity. Just the last thing I wanted to ask you, one little thing that comes up occasionally, Mike, is grass tetany a risk in early lactation, or is it more risk kind of March, April time?
So we'd probably see more of it in kind of that March, April time period, just the stage of the grass. But then it's still important to get the right levels of magnesium into the cow. Like we think about tetany, but there's also things like fiber digestion in the rumen, animal performance. So it's important when speccing those concentrates that you're adjusting CalMag or MagOx inclusion levels based on how much you're planning to feed. So we want to be getting that 30 grams of magnesium into the cow. And interesting, actually, we just did some mineral analysis on our on-farm experiment, and we're looking at mineral concentrations across the year, and we're finding grass is deficient in magnesium. But then a part of that we're not catching is the bioavailability of that magnesium, and it gets more locked up in that period you mentioned when you could encounter tetany. So that's where it's even more important to have your available source to the cows in terms of CalMag or Magox.
Okay, fair enough. Question in there, Mike, is the 3 to 4 kilos of meal, is that a maximum feed level or an optimum feed level?
So that would be optimum. So the thought process there, optimum in the early period of lactation. Just emphasize that. The thought process there is there's interesting financial modeling done by Lawrence Chalou and Elodie, and they looked at a number of different scenarios and different price indexes, milk price to feed ratios. And they found around annual level of 600 kilos of concentrate is the financial optimum. So if you kind of butter that out across the year, what does it look like? It looks like 3 or 4 kilos in that February, March, dropping them down to 2 kilos in April, and then 1 kind of May, June, July, before bringing some back in to help build cover. So that's the kind of financial optimum in that sense. And it seems like a sweet spot for the cow too. It kind of really maximizes the return on those 3 to 4 kilos and doesn't go beyond that where we start to get diminishing responses. So the other point as well, I suppose the important point, is that it's maximizing the return from that inexpensive pasture as well. We're not replacing pasture with concentrate and gaining a smaller margin and kind of going into that marginal milk territory.
No, I know. I suppose, but the only thing, Mike, and you have to put your hand up and say it, that's all modeled on excellence in terms of grass management.
So that would be, I suppose, the intricacies there is if you've poor digestibility in your swards or high pre-grazing yields, you'll have a lower UFL content in that basal diet, and then you'll get a better response to concentrate as you feed a higher UFL feed material. So should be mindful of that too, George, that if you're seeing a big response to your concentrate, maybe it's not necessarily a good thing. It could be indicative of your grassland management. So if you're
it's always the ultimate irony that the best responses to me come from the worst managed pastures.
Generally, fair point. And then, like, of course, we're in a strange scenario at the moment, the milk price to feed price ratio, and it could be, I suppose, encouraging to go after that. But I just be very mindful not to drift the system. That ratio tends to change a lot. And then again, don't be focusing on that marginal milk. Like, really maximize what you can get from your pasture-based system. And then that 3 to 4 kilos will help you financially to get a good return.
Okay. Right, guys and ladies, with that in mind and on those words, I'll just summarize maybe what Mike has said in 3 or 4 sentences. It seems from an optimal perspective, 3 to 4 kilos with conventional cows, normal, good, highly productive cows doing 30 odd litres average at peak, 3 to 4 litres with good grass in February is what we're talking about. What else did I pick up, Mike?
Don't be afraid to keep the protein down in the ration on grass consistently.
When you're on, exactly, that's probably the second point, and I suppose the third point that comes back to me all the time is, we're talking all the time about good grass management and having top class grass there for the cows. And I suppose the last point I picked up on from you, Mike, is that feeding to yield doesn't seem to be adding a whole lot where management is very good on farm.
Yeah, that'd be very fair. There's a small bit to be achieved around peak, but overall, I would be setting up the system to go after it.
Thanks very much, Mike, and thanks to our listeners for tuning in today. Next week, next Thursday morning, we're being joined by Mike Egan from Moore Park. Mike's a bit of interesting work done on dry matter intakes in early lactation in cows. So I think we'll listen to that next week and take from it what we can. It's to complement what Mike Dineen has been covering here this morning. And we will be also joined by a member of the Grass10 team again, just for a brief update on where grass is at the moment. Thanks very much, Mike, and thanks to our listeners, and safe farming.